Alright guys, so I got a couple different Israel updates that I want to get to here, starting with this. So a couple of days ago, I talked to you guys about how the United States at the United Nations Security Council for the third time vetoed a ceasefire resolution, calling for a ceasefire amidst Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza. And one of the main arguments that the United States representative put forward to justify that was this idea that the United States was working behind the scenes with nations like Qatar and Israel and Hamas in order to get a real ceasefire deal for the long term, and that this UNSC Council resolution would somehow be counterproductive to those efforts. And so we got an update here from Joe Biden as he was about to go and do this little suckfest over here on late night TV with Seth Meyers. And he said what we're about to listen to here, which is essentially that next Monday he expects a ceasefire to be in place. So let's go ahead and watch this.
Can you give us a sense of when you think that ceasefire will start, sir?
Well, I hope by the beginning of the weekend. I mean, the end of the weekend. At least my national security advisor tells me that we're close. We're close. It's not done yet. And my hope is by next Monday we'll have a ceasefire.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's a pretty big claim there, right? By Monday, we're going to have a ceasefire. I mean, that would be absolutely huge if it was true. Now, is it true? No, not exactly. Pretty much immediately, I mean, less than a day later, we've gotten reports like this. Israel and Hamas distanced themselves from Biden's optimism on Gaza ceasefire deal, and essentially throwing cold water on the idea that this Monday deadline that apparently Joe Biden sort of just like pulled out of his ass in this confused state as he was munching on his ice cream over here, threw cold water on that idea that this is, in any sense of the word, something that's on the table immediately in the near future. Now, maybe it could happen down the line, I don't know. But one other thing that I do want to point out about this so-called ceasefire deal is that according to all of the reading that I've done on it, it doesn't actually seem like it's a ceasefire. It is a temporary pause in the fighting to try to return all of the hostages that Hamas has in their captivity to Israel, and then for Israel to later on, whether it's a month down the line or 2 months down the line, to continue their offensive inside of Gaza. And so, to me, that's not a ceasefire. I mean, it's a temporary pause in the fighting, but it's not really a lasting ceasefire that is going to, in any meaningful capacity, resolve the current drastic humanitarian crisis inside of Gaza. And so, you know, I mean, it's kind of embarrassing for Joe Biden in some sense to come out and say something like that and make, you know, major international headlines by saying, oh, maybe by next week there's going to be a ceasefire in place. And then it just immediately collapses. And oh, by the way, his framing of what a ceasefire is isn't necessarily really a ceasefire. And oh, by the way, it also has a very low likelihood of actually being followed through on. So, I mean, maybe, you know, I cross my fingers and hope that I'm wrong about that. And maybe a ceasefire does come into play, at least to alleviate some of the immediate suffering of the innocent civilians that are being slaughtered in Gaza. But, you know, again, I won't hold my breath on that. And so now I want to move on to this, where this demon, Matthew Miller of the State Department, was asked a question about, you know, U.S. leverage over Israel, similar to that Nancy Pelosi clip that we watched a couple of days ago, where the journalist asked her, hey, you know that Ronald Reagan, back in the 80s, he called the prime minister then at the time of Israel and told him to cut out the bombing of Lebanon because Ronald Reagan saw it as a, quote, Holocaust. And 20 minutes later, the prime minister called him back and said that he had finished the bombing. You know, why does the United States not deploy the same kind of leverage that previous presidents have used? Okay, and she immediately imploded and collapsed and froze up and didn't know that history and didn't know how to respond to why Joe Biden is not utilizing any leverage whatsoever to pressure Israel to, you know, abide by what he thinks this war should be. And so in that same vein here, we got Matthew Miller being confronted on a similar topic here. So let's see how he responds.
Need to work with them on how to achieve that vision.
But you have so many. You have so many tools. Just my last follow-up. Sorry, but you have so much leverage over the Israelis, and this is fundamental vision of the president. So you can use all the leverage you want, including weapons that you sell to Israel, to make sure that this plan is at least on the right path for implementation, considering we have like short time between now and November.
So one thing I will say about that people often tend to forget is that Israel, like other countries in the region, is a sovereign country that makes its own decisions. The United States does not dictate to Israel what it must do, just as we don't dictate to any country what it must do. We present what we believe are the good one, Matt.
Okay, so in case you didn't hear it there, the volume was kind of low because his mic wasn't on, but I believe that was Matt Lee of the Associated Press. He spoke up there at the end and he said, unless we invade them, right, then we kind of dictate their policy agenda or their goals as a country. And so, I mean, listen, guys, I made this point on Twitter earlier. This is probably the single most ludicrous claim that I have ever heard made from this podium. The idea that the United States of America, the world's sole superpower, the most powerful military in the world, the most powerful economic power in the world, does not use our leverage, our power, to influence foreign governments and their policies is absolutely deranged. It is ahistorical, and it's completely detached from reality. I don't really know what else to say about that. I mean, obviously, in response to this, the United States does not dictate to Israel what it must do, just as we don't dictate to any country what it must do. Really? I mean, I could obviously bring up the decades and decades of U.S. meddling in Central and South America, or the Middle East for that matter, or in Asia, or countless other places around the world where the United States has, through violent means, through economic means, tried to enforce our will on the rest of these sort of self-identified global South countries, or as they refer to them as global South countries around the world. We could talk about the endless coup attempts and successful coups. We could talk about the sanctions and the embargoes. The idea that the U.S. doesn't enforce our will in other countries is absurd at face value. It's also absurd, again, because we've seen former U.S. presidents exert leverage specifically over Israel to get their way. We know that this is possible. We know that we've seen Israeli former politicians, current politicians, military leaders who have said, without U.S. supplies on weapons and on aid otherwise, that we would not be able to continue doing what we're doing. We know how reliant Israel is on U.S. weapons. And so if the response here is to say, well, they're a sovereign country, they make their own decisions, then why the fuck are you sending them weapons? Why are you trying to force through $14 billion on top of the already $3.5 billion that we give them on an annual basis? Why are you trying to give them that weaponry, that material aid, if they don't need it, if they are simply a sovereign country acting on their own volition, with no input necessary from the United States of America? I mean, these are our tax dollars, if you want to frame it that way. This is, our government that is supporting and endorsing and funding and arming what Israel is doing right now. And so you are complicit in what Israel does with the weapons that you give them. So to just turn around and to say, well, we have nothing to do with their decision-making process, what the fuck are you talking about? I mean, we've also seen other reports. There was one from The Intercept that detailed how the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Air Force is aiding Israel in their targeting of certain locations inside of Gaza. So the U.S. military, not only are we sending them weapons to use on the people of Gaza, we are actually directly in an intelligence apparatus or in a logistical military apparatus way. We are giving them the support in order to strike certain places inside of Gaza. So we are directly implicated at every single level of this genocide that you want to look at it. And they just want to turn around, throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we have nothing to do with it. This is just Israel acting on their own volition. What are we supposed to do? Deploy our leverage that we have over them? What are you, fucking crazy? I mean, that's the response to this. It's pathetic. And so we also had this here to show just another example of Netanyahu's sort of like spitting in the eye of Joe Biden, who has been giving him, the bear hug since the beginning of this operation on October 7th. So they say here, the initial tweet sparking this off, Barak Ravid, says that President Biden said in his NBC interview last night that the path the Netanyahu government is taking will make Israel lose support around the world. That's true. That's a true statement from Joe Biden. You would then question, why is he not using his leverage to force Israel to change positions, right? If you don't want them to lose standing on the international stage, which I think they've already obliterated, and so has the United States. But here we have the response from Netanyahu, who released a video in which his office framed as, quote, a response to President Joe Biden. In the video, Netanyahu pushed back on Biden's claim that the Israeli government is losing international support. He said that since the beginning of the Gaza war, he's been leading a campaign aimed at countering international pressure to end the war ahead of time and to mobilize support for Israel. Netanyahu said that the campaign was successful and quoted a Howard Harris poll published today, which claimed to show that 82% of Americans supported Israel. He said, "This gives us more backing to continue the war until victory." Whatever victory means in his eyes, maybe that's the entirety, the entire ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip and pushing them into the Sinai Peninsula. Maybe it means destroying 100% of the housing in Gaza instead of just like 70 or 80%. Maybe it means, obliterating a couple 10,000 more civilians. I mean, who knows what that means, victory in his mind, because it certainly can't mean that he intends to completely destroy Hamas and remove them from power, because that's not happening. It is not going to be successful from a military capacity. And so, yet to be seen exactly what he means by victory in this sense. But I mean, again, the idea that, 86% of Americans support Israel. Well, sure, I mean, maybe if you ask it in the most general way possible, and you say, do you support Israel, or Israel's right to exist, I guess, maybe then you could say 86% of the American people support Israel. But I mean, I've shown you guys other polling data. A vast majority of the country supports a ceasefire in Gaza. So in other words, a majority of the country does not support you continuing this war endlessly. Okay, that's not the reality. A majority of Democrats at this point, Joe Biden's own supporters who voted for him in 2020, believe that this is a genocide that he is currently supporting. So how do you square the fact that 50% or more of Democrats think that you're committing a genocide, but also somehow 86% of the population supports everything that you're doing? I mean, it is just utterly delusional. And so I want to move on to a couple of other things that I wanted to mention here real quick. So on the domestic front, inside of Israel, obviously we've talked about how the Netanyahu government, the Israeli security forces and authorities have been arresting not only Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza and subjecting them in many cases to torture, but also Israeli citizens, right? Jewish Israeli citizens who have dared to even mildly critique the war on Gaza in any capacity. And they have been arresting them and putting them in confined conditions and everything that you could possibly imagine, right? Teachers and random civilians who have been roped up in this in an effort to crack down on any dissent on Netanyahu's government. And so we also had this. Tonight in Tel Aviv, so this is from a couple of days ago here, released hostage. Okay, this is a released hostage we're talking about here. Ilana takes cover as police use a water cannon during a protest calling on Israel's government to return the hostages held in Gaza. So there is a protest, and this is something we've seen consistently for a while now, where former hostages themselves are participating, or families of the hostages who are still being held are participating, and calling for some sort of a deal to be made immediately to actually get the hostages home. And this is a point I've been making for a while now, guys. The way to get the hostages home, which is something that the Biden administration, the Israeli government, many Americans who support Israel's offensive into Gaza, they make that a core part of their argument. That, well, you can't possibly call for a ceasefire, we need to get the hostages home. Guys, the only way that you are realistically going to get these hostages home is through a ceasefire deal. The military campaign has produced what? Literally less than a handful of hostages who have been returned. Israel, I mean, at this point has killed with their own military forces the same amount of hostages that they have rescued with their military forces. The only large-scale return of hostages to Israel from Hamas's captivity has been through that temporary ceasefire that we got all the way back in, I think it was November. Okay? So that's the only path forward to actually getting the hostages home. And of course, the Netanyahu government doesn't care about getting the hostages home. He cares about prolonging this war. He cares about expanding this war to keep himself in power, so that he doesn't have to face any sort of political accountability or even criminal accountability. Because that's the only way that he can do that, is to keep himself in power. And the longer the war goes on, especially if it expands to involve maybe Hezbollah or even Iran in a worst case scenario, then the more likely it is that he is going to remain in power for the immediate foreseeable future. To the point where they are now spraying water cannons at former hostages, at the very people who Israel is pretending are at the top of their priority list. And we've had some examples of Israeli politicians who have come out and accidentally, or not even accidentally, but have said the quiet part out loud, like Bezalel Smotrich, who just about a week ago came out and literally said, with no exaggeration, that the hostages are not our top priority, right? Our priority is destroying Hamas, even if that maybe means that we're going to go in and we're going to, bomb the entirety of the Gaza Strip and kill a lot of the hostages in the meantime. So that's their actual priority, right? Now, moving on, we also had this story that kind of blew my mind when I first saw it. But it's shocking to see, but it's not surprising, given some of the recent stories that we've talked about. So here we have the Palestinian Red Crescent that has come out and said that they are officially suspending all coordination of medical missions in Gaza for 48 hours. Now, why are they doing this? Because, keep in mind, guys, we talked about that story recently of the Palestinian Red Crescent who made an attempt, coordinated with Israel, to go and rescue Hind Rajab, that 6-year-old child who was stuck in a car after Israel had killed the rest of her family that was in the car with her. And she made this desperate call, this desperate plea to the PRCS to come and save her. And so they waited and they looked for an opportunity. They coordinated with the IDF and said, we're going to go out there with an ambulance crew and try to rescue her so that she's not stuck in the car, inevitably to be bombed or shot or starved to death. And they went out, and then what happened? Even after coordination with the IDF, they were killed. They bombed the ambulance, and apparently it was meters away from the car. So they waited for them to go and intentionally struck this ambulance after they had coordinated with the IDF to go and do this rescue operation. And so it's not surprising that the PRCS now is basically coming out and saying, we're going to suspend our coordination with the IDF because we legitimately don't know if coordinating with them to tell them where our medical workers are or where our ambulances are going, we don't know if that's going to help us or to hurt us, in the sense that we may coordinate with the IDF and then they may go out and explicitly target us if we tell them where we're going. Just to give you a perspective of where we're at in this war right now, especially considering the broader attacks on the Gaza healthcare system, where we have seen countless hospitals, medical facilities, medical workers who have been targeted during this operation. I mean, this is just unfathomable here, guys. Now, another thing, which again should be shocking, and I guess it is shocking, but also somehow unsurprising. So we've talked about the stories of Israeli citizens, civilians, who have gone out to the border of Gaza and have basically set up camp in an effort to starve the children of Gaza. I don't know how else to frame exactly what they're doing here. They're camping out at the border to blockade some of the aid trucks that are supposed to be going to the hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza who are currently starving. We've already gotten the reports of children who are now literally starving to death at this point, of mothers who are so starved out at this point that they can no longer even produce milk for their infant children to be able to survive. So when you understand the reality of that and how Palestinians have been resorting to eating scraps of food and grass in some occasions, have no reliable access to clean drinking water or medical supplies for that matter, where a vast majority of the population has been internally displaced, stuffed into refugee camps like in Rafah, where over 1 million people are currently located and where Israel is planning their upcoming offensive. And amidst all of that context of bloodshed and starvation and the worst humanitarian crisis that you could possibly imagine, these Israeli civilians are deciding to go and set up camp at the border to prevent aid from getting in. And keep in mind, even if they weren't doing this protest, the Israeli government was already preventing a majority of the aid from getting in, to the point where it's nowhere close to enough to what they actually need right now. They're setting up bouncy castles, guys. Bouncy castles on the border of the Gaza Strip. So just to give you a perspective, right? Because I think this is an important point to make here, right? Because a lot of people in the mainstream media, a lot of people in the United States have some sort of a warped perspective here where this is like two equal sides, equal militaries going to battle with each other, and that it's a typical standard war. That is not what this is. On one side of this fence that you see here, you have hundreds of thousands of people who are starving, millions who have been displaced, okay? You have civilian infrastructure that has been decimated, hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, UN shelters, refugee camps that have been relentlessly attacked and bombarded. And then on the other side of the fence, you have completely fine Israeli civilians who are going and throwing raves and setting up bouncy castles and having fun camping sessions on the direct border with Gaza. Just to give you a perspective in terms of the power dynamics of the so-called war. And that's why sometimes I like to catch myself, because I don't even want to describe this as a war, because it's not a war. It's overwhelmingly just a massacre of innocent civilians that we're talking about here. We also have some more psychotic IDF TikToks and posts that have come out recently. This is one of an IDF soldier who is laying in a crib with a stuffed animal here, presumably of a child that has either been forcefully displaced or potentially even killed, and he's going and laying in this and posing with it, I don't know, as if it's a goof and a gag, right? And also things like this. I mean, this was just one example, hanging lingerie on the front of their Humvees or military trucks or whatever as they're going about their genocidal campaign here. I also saw another one of an IDF soldier who had the audacity to take a picture in the home of somebody who had been forced out or killed, and he hung up on the wall behind him a bunch of underwear and lingerie of the families who he had just forced out. And he hung it up on the wall behind him, took a picture of himself, and then made that as part of his like Tinder profile. Okay? To give you a perspective in terms of the mindset that a lot of these war criminals have amidst all of this. Now, I also wanted to show you guys this. So there was this film that came out. I haven't had a chance to watch it, but it's called No Other Land. Okay? And it's on the brutal expulsion of Palestinians, and it's on the, inequality between Israeli citizens and, Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza and the rest of that. And this won some award, right, in Berlin, I guess, or in Germany. And so one of the creators of this film, you have an Israeli and you have a Palestinian here, he gave a speech afterwards. And so I'm going to watch this, and then we're going to read what Mehdi Hassan just said about it. So here's the speech that they gave.
I want to say we are standing in front of you now. Me and Bassel are the same age. I am Israeli, Bassel is Palestinian. And in 2 days, we will go back to a land where we are not equal. I am living under a civilian law, and Bassel is under military law. We live 30 minutes from one another, but I have voting rights. Bassel is not having voting rights. I'm free to move where I want in this land. Bassel is, like millions of Palestinians, locked in the occupied West Bank. This situation of apartheid between us, this inequality, it has to end. I want to say we are standing in front of...
Okay. So, I mean, good for him, good for them, for winning this award or having the opportunity to present this kind of a conversation in front of a crowd of people. What he's saying there, I think, is completely incontroversial at this point, right? The idea that Israel is operating an apartheid system where they are effectively occupying the West Bank and Gaza, obviously now, but even before October 7th, we're effectively occupying the Gaza Strip and have a system of apartheid where guys like these can be living 30 minutes apart from each other, and yet one of them can vote, one of them cannot. One of them has freedom of movement, one of them does not. Completely set up with a completely set of rules, depending on what their ethnic background is, what their religious background is, what family they happen to come from. I mean, this is the system of apartheid that we've talked about relentlessly, that every single major human rights organization around the planet has admitted to right now. Even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem have described the apartheid in brutal, gruesome details. And so the follow-up here is pointed out by Mehdi Hassan, is that the mayor of Berlin in Germany, who isn't Jewish, accused this Israeli Jewish journalist of anti-Semitism and warned the Berlinale Film Festival not to allow such speeches again. Authoritarian insanity in Germany. And so, I talk a lot about the flaws of the sort of Overton window of conversation here in the United States, and even in some cases like Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in our Congress, being censured by Congress for criticizing Israel and for using phrases like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So we obviously have our own issues here in the United States. Germany is on an entirely different level, to the point where I've seen stories of them, their police forces, arresting Jewish protesters under the guise of anti-Semitism charges for being critical of Israel. It's like, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, they went so 180 in the opposite direction that now they are the biggest supporters of a genocide against the people of Gaza, against Palestinians, because I guess they're scared of potentially even hypothetically being accused of anti-Semitism, even if that means calling Jewish journalists or Jewish protesters or Jewish activists anti-Semitic for disagreeing with you. Even, as he points out here, the mayor of Berlin, who's not even fucking Jewish. So who the fuck are you to say that something is anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic? To accuse a Jewish journalist of anti-Semitism for disagreeing with you, for acknowledging the existence of an apartheid. This is where we're at, guys. It's utterly absurd. And I'm going to finish off with this just real quick. And I'm going to link this down below if you want to go read the entirety of the article, because I don't have the time to get into all of it. But it is just a good reminder here. Because as we have been talking relentlessly about Gaza, because it's an important issue to talk about, obviously, and to stay closely on top of, we also have to remember this, that the slow-rolling ethnic cleansing inside of the West Bank is continuing. And not only is it continuing, but it's actually accelerating as everybody is focused more so on Gaza. The Benjamin Netanyahu government, his coalition of guys like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, settler terrorists, I think it would be accurate to call them, are aggressively pushing forward with plans to, for instance, demolish Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem and throughout the rest of the West Bank in order to make way for Jewish settlements. So, I mean, this is the underlying project of Zionism at play here, right? We're not talking about people who are Hamas militants who are being raided or attacked because they're evil terrorists. We're talking about civilians here, guys. I mean, the same applies to Gaza, obviously, but in this case, it's not even ambiguous. We're talking about a state-sanctioned apparatus of the expulsion of people from their homes, in many cases that they have lived in for generations, who were born in these homes. And they are being expelled because the Israeli government, the Israeli state apparatus, wants them removed so that they can make way for Israeli settlers to go and take their place. It is an open ethnic cleansing. And at the same time, we have this ICJ case, which is the second one, not the original South Africa one for genocide. We have a second ICJ case that is currently underway that is talking about Israel's illegal, brazenly illegal, occupation of Palestinian territories, especially since 1967. Okay? And so that case is underway. Israel apparently chose not to go directly defend themselves, but had some of their other lackey countries defending them in their stead. And, that case is proceeding against them. I don't know how it could possibly come to any other conclusion than it is objectively illegal to occupy and to forcefully expel civilians from their homes in order to make way for settlers, that is completely illegal under international law. And, this is something that we just can't take our eyes off, because this is happening in the background. It doesn't get as much attention in the national news. It doesn't even get as much attention from independent outlets like me. I mean, this is why I try to go out of my way to mention this in a video like this, is because otherwise we may not get a chance to talk about it. But this is just as important as anything else that is going on. If for no other reason, then it is emblematic of the entire structural issue that is at the core of what people refer to as the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're talking about a decades-long occupation, an apartheid, and an ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people here.